after. I'm Ashutosh Varshne, Director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, and it's a very, very great pleasure to introduce to you and to welcome again Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. We call him Sara. He's been my friend, philosopher, and guide on Sri Lanka. His institution, CPA, was my institutional home in Colombo and Sri Lanka for 10 years, from 2001 to 2011. I was there twice a year, roughly. And his team was my research team for the three cities that I was researching: Colombo, Kandy, and Negombo. And of course, I would take some time off and go off to Dambulla and watch cricket. I've learned always a very great deal from Sara's analysis of Sri Lanka, and the more formal introduction is as follows. I'll tell you how I viewed him. Basically, he's been the founding director and is currently the executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. He's served on the board of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute of International and Strategic Studies. He is the founding director of the Sri Lanka chapter of Transparency International and a founding co-convener of the Center for Monitoring Election Violence. Sara was educated at the London School of Economics, where he took his PhD in international relations. And he will speak to us for about, he was also on a committee that President Obama established. So you can see that he's been widely recognized for what he has achieved working in Sri Lanka and in Colombo. The topic is Sri Lanka in crisis, democratic government imperiled with a question mark. And as a political scientist, I might say something about democracy in Sri Lanka first, before Sara takes over. It is not known beyond the circle of democracy theorists, generally not known. It's known in Sri Lanka, not even in India, that Sri Lanka was the first universal franchise democracy in what we call the Global South today. And that happened as early as 1931. India was next. India in 47, finally. Technically in 52, because that was the first general election with universal franchise, but approved, of course, earlier. Sri Lanka was the first universal franchise democracy of the Global South. Universal franchise began in the 19-teens in the world, in Britain, and the United States of America, whose democracy I've been studying of late in a comparative perspective, had universal a male franchise for a very brief period between 1870 and roughly 1876, after which blacks who were given the right to vote in 1870 via the 15th Constitutional Amendment increasingly lost the right to vote under the so-called Jim Crow regime in the American South. And America got universal franchise back only in 1965. Right? They kept losing, the black community kept losing its rights, and of course women didn't have the right to vote until the 19-teens and 1920s. Sri Lanka started with universal franchise. It is also generally argued, and let's see what Sara has to say about this, that majoritarian nationalism approved by the state also began in Sri Lanka, at least in South Asia. In South Asia, not elsewhere. Elsewhere it began, with the Sinhala-only policy of 1956. So from the perspective of political science, Sri Lanka has been a very interesting case to study, and of course also for conflict later. But democracy theory, democratic theory, in its various incarnations, has paid attention to Sri Lanka for the remarkable start it made. That the democracy of Sri Lanka is imperiled now, though with a question mark, is itself an important issue to study, analyze, and understand. So with these words, Sarah, thank you for joining us. A week ago, he gave us an overview of Sri Lanka's politics since 1948, and today the focus will be, though there will be a background, I'm sure, historical background, the focus today will be on the recent political developments. Sarah.
Thank you, Ashu, for that very generous introduction. The topic of my talk to you today is whether the crisis of governance in Sri Lanka is actually with us or is it about to happen. And I think the crisis of governance in Sri Lanka has been always in the making, always in the state of becoming, and now it's probably in the state of being, actually. Let me go back a bit. Sri Lanka got independence in 1948. We did not have an independence movement in that we did not have anything resembling what happened in India at all. What we did have was a bunch of upper middle class people, English speaking largely, who had been to university in Oxford and Cambridge, who got together and decided to negotiate independence. And these people were culled from, they were from all communities, all religions, and we got independence over the table, as it were, without any sort of problem with regard to it. And I think the founding assumption at that time with regard to Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was then known, was the notion that here is a country where you had an educated elite who could govern, who knew parliamentary democracy inside out, as it were, and who can govern on the basis of the principle that this country is based on unity in diversity. Unity in diversity, that there were many communities, many ethnicities, many religions, all the big religions in the world were represented in Sri Lanka, but that there was no reason to make any special mention in the constitutional architecture with regard to any of those communities, because they all implicitly shared this sort of notion that, yes, we can all live together. And therefore, it was a unitary state. There was no question of devolution or anything like that. It was a unitary state, and we say back at home that federalism, the F word, as it were, was a bad word in Sri Lanka, and still continues to be, as it was in Britain, but no more, perhaps. Yeah. So it was that kind of cozy relationship that survived until there was a problem, and that was that the founder, Prime Minister D.S. Nayaka, had to have a successor, and he chose his son over Mr. S.W.R. Bandaranaike, who was from the leading family in terms of the southern landowning class, and he was educated in Oxford and was a brilliant orator and all of that kind of thing. He decides to break and form his own party. But what is interesting in that was that because of that personal animosity or competition between these two sort of families, the Sennaikas and the Bandaranaikes, that took on a much bigger dimension, because Bandaranaike ostensibly left on the basis that the majority of the people in the country, the Sinhalese, were effectively not independent because the English language and the upper middle class were very much the ruling elite in the country. And so in 1956, Bandaranaike leads a coalition of indigenous doctors, trade unionists, farmers, priests, who come together in what was called the Pancha Balavegaya, a five-pronged, powerful task force, as it were, on the issue of language. That Sinhala, the language of the majority community, should be made the official language of the country. Now, these were issues that came up in the past as well. In 1931, when we got universal franchise, yes, it came up in the State Council and all of that. But now we were independent. Our destiny was supposed to be in our own hands. And on this basis of Sinhala being the official language of the country, he swept to power in 1956. And in 1957, he then brought in the Sinhala-only policy, whereby Sinhala was to be the official language of the country. It's interesting, if you look at the sort of historical records of that period, you will find that after the first session of Parliament in 1956, crowds outside invaded the chamber. They sat in the Speaker's chair. They took the mace in their hands. This was the popular demonstration, as it were, that we now really have our sovereignty. We are now really the power. And they call the government Apeandua, our government. Contrast that with the Argale, which only happened a couple of months ago, where they did storm the President's house, the Presidential Secretariat. They didn't make it to Parliament. They tried, but they didn't. But there again, it was very much an affirmation, a demonstration of people's power. Anyway, 1956 was very much, therefore, an attempt to dislodge the Anglicized elite from the pinnacles of power. However, what it did was it alienated the Tamil community and, of course, the Burgher community as well, people with European blood. Now, the Tamil community has always been one that has given a great priority to education, to working in the civil service. The Tamil parts of the country, as some of you may well know, are not as fertile as the Sinhala South, where they say you throw a seed and it'll grow without any, tending or caring. And so they had to leave, basically, the key positions in the civil service that they occupied. And that, I think, was the start of the majoritarianism that has come to be a hallmark of Sri Lankan politics. Because when they left, people were put in who were basically Sinhala speakers. Right? They were Sinhala speakers, then the government also proceeded to nationalize transport, the bus services, set up a people's bank, a state-owned banks. All of those were brought in 1956. And so what we therefore have is also the beginnings of a two-party system, a proper two-party system. At the point of elections, at the point of independence, we did have, roughly speaking, a two-party system whereby the leftist, the Trotsky party, the LSSP, the Lanka Samaja party, was one of the biggest parties at that time, and they formed the opposition. That also led to the disenfranchisement of the descendants of the workers who were brought from southern India to work on the tea plantations. They were assumed to be going to vote leftist, and if that was allowed to continue in the context of the Cold War, etc., that you would have a government that would be a very leftist one. Yeah? So you have a two-party system that comes in 1956, and you therefore have the beginnings of the majoritarianism. There's one other thing, of course, that happened, and that was that the Tamils, the Tamil community, who in 1953 had started on the basis of the disenfranchisement of the Indian plantation workers, had started something called the Federal Party. The argument there was that you need to devolve power, you need to have a structure of power whereby the minorities will be able to feel that they are autonomous, but yet at the same time interdependent, apart from and yet a part of. The Federal Party, from that point onwards, emerges as the single largest party as far as the Tamil community is concerned. And they launched various peaceful satyagrahas and all of that against the Sinhala-only act, but they were defeated. they were unsuccessful. There were riots, the first riots in independent Sri Lanka, riots, and many people were killed and had to flee from Colombo in particular back to the north and east. Bandaranaike tried to assuage their fears by coming up with something called the Bandaranaike-Chelvanagam Pact, which allowed a certain amount of autonomy in the north and east, but quite literally, whilst he was sitting down and finalizing the agreement with Mr. Chelvanagam, the leader of the Tamil community, a whole mass of Buddhist monks demonstrated outside of his house with the collusion of the United National Party, and he was forced to literally tear up that agreement, and it never came into being. If it did come into being, well, perhaps the history of Sri Lanka would have been different in terms of the ethnic conflict, but he had to tear it up and throw it away. Well, Bandaranaike was assassinated in 1959, and his wife becomes the first female prime minister in the world, and her notion of her husband's legacy was very much the singular majority authoritarianism. And she continued that policy of nationalizing parts of the economy as well as parts of the general governance structure as well. Lake House, which was the principal media institution in the country, was one that was targeted by her administration. She flushed out the bureaucracy and brought in people who were supporters, in effect. And in 1962, we had an attempted coup by basically Western-educated military officers whose argument was that Mrs. Bandaranaike did not know anything about politics or government, and she was dangerously taking Sri Lanka on a leftward trend, and she had to be overthrown. The coup did not succeed, and as a consequence of that, she was even more determined that those structures of power would be reformed to more readily reflect the demographic composition in the country, the political ideologies prevalent in the country, open them up. So what we have as we go into the 1970s is a situation in which an old order begins to break down. An old order which was largely an elite-based consensus begins to break down. Parliament, which was the site of disputation and contestation, now becomes less relevant. It moves out into the streets. The decade of the 1970s in that respect is very, very important because Mrs. Bandaranaike wins an election by a two-thirds majority, comes into power. She changes the constitution, declares Sri Lanka a republic, and says that we will be a unitary state, no question of sharing power. We will also have Sinhala as the official language of the country in the constitution, and Buddhism, which was the majority community's religion, would have foremost place. We didn't declare ourselves a theocracy, but we gave Buddhism the foremost place. So the key markers of that Sinhala Buddhist identity were enshrined in the Constitution in 1972. Yeah. Now, when she came into office, she had come into office on the basis of a sort of left-leaning coalition. However, there was a youth insurgency in 1971 that did not believe that she would fulfill the promises made to them. And there were roughly about 40 to 50,000 young people who were killed in that insurgency, the first JVP or Janata Vimukti Peramuna insurgency. Secondly, towards the end of her tenure, that was roughly 76, 77, you started also having the beginnings of the insurgency amongst the Tamil youth. Because the education policy under Mrs. Bandaranaike's government was one which favored the rural Sinhala peasantry Whereas in the North, it was very much the notion of you get the best grades as far as maths and sciences are concerned, and you have to go to university, but that was not the case. You were locked out. So by 1970...
Sir, can you explain a bit what exactly was it about the admission policy?
Yeah.
How did it run? How did it exclude the merit,
Yeah.
the merit-based entry?
So what it did was you got into university on the basis of points based on your exam results. But those points were weighted heavily in favor of the rural lot, as opposed to those from the North and East who were allowed to go, who were taken in on the basis of the results that they got in the exam. Yeah? So this was kind of empowering the majority community to basically become government clerks. That was what it was, because Sinhala was not a language that was spoken anywhere else in the world. If the government was going to be the biggest employer in the country, then Sinhala would be the passport to getting into government service.
So effectively, it was a quota system, even though
No,
formally
it was not. Yeah.
Basically, points of the rural people
were
raised
in order to get them into university.
So
Yeah.
so it's not a formal quota system, but that's how
That's
you
how it
manipulate
works.
points and you get in.
Yeah, exactly.
I have one question. What the language and Tamil community and they spoke?
Sorry?
What the
What like the
language?
Tamil community? Did they know any Sinhala?
Not that
Okay.
much.
So
So it was very much Tamil and English. And the ruling elite, from the civil service to the courts and everything, was conducted in English at that time. In fact, it still is, a fair amount of it. Yeah. So the Tamil community, the younger people who were effectively shut out of university, etc., took to the streets and took to arms. Their argument was that the federal party that was formed in 1953 was packed with lawyers, and again, of a certain class and status, etc. They had talked and talked unto death with governments, but had not succeeded in getting any relief. The only way, therefore, was through armed struggle. So by the 1970s, we had the first insurrection of youth in the South, as well as the beginnings of what became the 30-year civil war as far as the North and East is concerned. But in 1977, Mrs. Bandaranaike's government lost an election to the United National Party under Jayajayawardena, who won with a 5/6 majority. Now, Jayajayawardena, if anyone has had a personal impact on the politics and governance of Sri Lanka, it is he, because he decided, therefore, that the parliamentary democratic tradition that Sri Lanka had didn't work. Because every 5 years you could get in a government to come in and completely reverse what the previous government did. There was no continuity, there was no consistency, the environment for investment also was not there. So his argument was, we need to have an executive presidency. And an executive presidency would provide strong government to develop the country, as well as unite the country, because the executive president would be directly elected by the people. Yeah? He wouldn't have to answer to the whims and fancies of a fickle parliamentary majority. And he would, in effect, as he said at one time when he was asked, he said, the only thing I can't do as an executive president is to change the sex of an individual. And in effect, he was probably quite right in that respect. So in 1977, we changed our system of government completely from the sort of Westminster type orientation to an executive presidency. They've called it a goalist model, but it's not really even a goalist model. It is much more like the constitution that Ghana got, I think, in 1956 when it got independence, when Nkrumah became the leader of Ghana. It was completely tilted in favor of the scepter, he also did one other thing, and that was he changed the electoral system. We moved away from first-past-the-post constituencies to an electoral unit of a district. Yeah? And as a consequence, the party secretaries got a tremendous amount of influence in terms of who went to Parliament, because the lists weren't entirely closed. So even after the election, you would find that defeated candidates could actually get into Parliament. Yeah? So you then also got with Jajawarna a complete change as far as the economic policy of the country was concerned. We were the first in that respect also to liberalize the economy in 1977. Now, the arguments that he brought up were that you needed a strong government for development, you needed a strong government for national unity, and therefore you needed the executive presidency. However, as far as the executive presidency is concerned, we've had, again, an insurrection in the South, a 30-year civil war, and yes, we have made some progress, certainly, as far as economic development is concerned, but we've also lost so many economic opportunities precisely because of these conflicts and not being able to resolve them in any way, because the underlying pattern that had emerged in Sri Lankan politics at that time was that the majoritarianism was a key factor. So that when you were in opposition, you opposed any government who was trying to make any settlement as far as that ethnic conflict was concerned. When you got into government and you tried to do something likewise, the other party would oppose. So we got that situation whereby you had a structure of government which was authoritarian, where you now, from privileging the majority community in terms of language, in terms of religion, now you had concentrated power all in one office, and that office would invariably be held by someone from the majority community with the singular Buddhist identity. Yeah. Now, going beyond that, of course, was how did the people in the country at the end of the day react to all of this in terms of what happened to the political culture? I think if you go to Sri Lanka, you will find the classic example. It's a bit of a cliche now. You can go down roads in Colombo where you will find a mosque, a church, a Hindu temple, and a Buddhist temple. And people live perfectly happily with each other. However, there are times when they are politically aroused and they go into frenzies of violence, like they did in 1983, where thousands of Tamils were basically burnt on the roads. Their houses, etc., were burnt, and you set off what is now the major Tamil diaspora in Canada in particular, but Australia, the United States, and Britain. The inability and unwillingness of the singular majority community to come up with a constitutional architecture that was based on this notion of unity in diversity and a recognition that sharing power was not losing power, has always blighted Sri Lanka's prospects in terms of economic development. Yeah. Now, attempts were made subsequently to that to deal with this ethnic conflict, but nothing came about it. And in 2005, we had Mahinda Rajapaksa elected as president of Sri Lanka. Mahinda Rajapaksa is elected in 2005 only because Velupillai Prabhakaran, the leader of the Tamil Tigers, decided that Rajapaksa was the epitome of the singular Buddhist identity and majoritarianism, and he should be allowed to become president, because then he will wage war against the Tamil community, and he will wage it in a way that international sympathy would accrue to the Tamil community and they would get their political demands thereby. So he paid the LTT to impose a boycott in the presidential election of 2005 in the North and East. That succeeded, and as a consequence, Mahinda Rajapaksa becomes president. If he had not done that, it's almost certain that he won that election by 100,000 odd votes, that Ranil Wickremesinghe, the current president, would have been elected in 2005. Now, the Rajapaksas, I think we need to sort of spend a bit of time on in terms of pointing out that family politics, dynastic politics in Sri Lanka has been there right from the start. The UNP, the leading party when we got independence, used to be known as the uncle-nephew party because it was all in the family. The SLFP went from husband to widow and then to daughter. Ranil Wickremesinghe also is part of the family that founded the United National Party. Now, the Rajapaksas are, yes, they are landed gentry, but of a much lower order. And they come from the south of the country. And so their ascent to power is also about establishing that family, that dynasty, as the key dynasty in Sri Lankan politics. So when Mahinda Rajapaksa became president, his brother was made defense secretary, another brother was effectively the Minister of Finance, and we had about 30-odd members of the family who were given positions of power and responsibility in government. Mahinda Rajapaksa runs for the presidency as a great populist, as the sort of great leader of the Sinhalese and all of that. But in effect, he really does not have an ideology as such, apart from establishing his family as the key actors in Sri Lankan politics. Anyway, the one policy, I suppose, that he did agree to do was to win the war at whatever cost. And that he did in 2009, amidst a whole set of allegations that there were war crimes and crimes against humanity committed and were officially sanctioned by Gotabaya Rajapaksa as Defense Secretary. Now, from that point onwards, Rajapaksas are tremendously popular in the country as the saviors of the Sinhalese because they defeated this appalling terrorist group called the LTTE. But the Rajapaksas then go on to, there is no other way of saying this, but to basically embezzle the treasury of the country. And the accusation is that from 2005 onwards, that they have looted the country in terms of, projects where they've got commissions, where money has been, budgets have been exaggerated in order to put money into the pockets of people. Basil Rajapaksa, who was the finance minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother, was known as Mr. 10% in the country, So they built a lot of infrastructure, but they also did a lot of vanity projects in the area in the south from which they came from. And as a consequence of that, the whole point is that with the infrastructure and all of that, it needs to pay dividends to pay back the loans that you've taken to build it in the first place. There were no returns here, as such. There were no returns as such, and as a consequence, apart from the migrant workers to the Middle East, the money that we got from tea and from tourism, we didn't really have any sources of income in Sri Lanka as a consequence. And because of the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity and all of that, the Rajapaksas then lent very heavily on China. Now, the Chinese are not Sri Lanka's biggest creditors. But what the Chinese are responsible for is lending, yes, a substantial amount to Sri Lanka, but without any transparency or any accountability. It's shrouded in opaqueness. So no one knows how much, who got what, and when and where kind of thing. So, as a consequence, we now have, after roughly from 2005 to 2019, with just an interregnum in between, that many years of Rajapaksa rule without any real benefits to the people at large. In the north and east, there was absolute unwillingness to come up with a political settlement of the conflict. As a consequence, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is meeting at the present moment, started passing resolutions on Sri Lanka. The government's response was to come up with commission after commission promising various mechanisms of transitional justice, but never implementing them in full. At the present moment, we now have within the Office of the High Commission something called the Accountability Project, by which evidence and information with regard to war crimes is being collected and collated. In 2015, when the government was the government of Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe that defeated Mahinda Rajapaksa at the polls, they said the government of Sri Lanka will set up 4 mechanisms for transitional justice: an Office of Missing Persons, an Office of Reparations, a Truth and Justice Commission, as well as an accountability mechanism which would involve foreign judges and even prosecutors. That, of course, was a red flag to a bull as far as the domestic political equilibrium was concerned. And it still is. The government keeps insisting that it's outside of the constitution of the country. That's not the case at all. But nevertheless, accountability is now entirely shrouded now in impunity. As the High Commissioner said in her latest report on Sri Lanka, the key problem with regard to governance is impunity. And that impunity holds with regard to civil and political rights, but it also holds with regard to the financial dimension as well. As a consequence of the Rajapaksa rule in Sri Lanka, we don't have a single institution of government or governance that functions in the way that it was supposed to. Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother more so than him, have put in members of the family as well as former army officers and serving officers into key positions of state, without any question of their capability to do the job at all. Yeah? So the Sri Lankan government had become a kind of Rajapaksa Incorporated, because there was no question of accountability for war crimes or financial crimes or anything like that. There has been a total degradation of the judiciary as well as the bureaucracy in general. Yeah. So how did we come to this crisis that we have at the present moment? I think it is very much of a crisis of governance, because you can get the technical expertise to resolve the economic question, but you have to have the political will, the leadership qualities, and the commitment to have transparent and accountable governance at the helm at the leadership level. At one level, the economic dimension of this crisis is something that has accumulated over the years. The Rajapaksas just contributed towards it in a very distinctive and extravagant manner that he brought it to a crescendo. From independence onwards, we have treated the polity, the citizenry of the country, not really as citizens, but as voters. Every party promises that they will give 10,000 jobs in the public service and 10,000 rupees more to those who are in the public service. As a consequence, you have about 1.5 million people who are on the public payroll for a population of 22 million. Then you have state-owned enterprises which are providing subsidies to everyone, but which are making losses of millions by the day. In addition to that, you don't have a proper tax system. I think there are only about 250,000 tax files in the country until this president, the last, Ranil Wickremesinghe, said that everyone over the years of 18 would have to have a tax file. Furthermore, as a consequence of the war, you have a huge military budget which has burgeoned ever since the war ended to the point where it is even greater than the health, the allocation for health and for education. Yeah. So we basically became a Greece who risked becoming a Lebanon. And when Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected president in 2019, he was elected president on a platform of, again, strong government, technocratic government. And this was to be compared with the regime that interrupted the Rajapaksa rule, the regime of Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe, who were seen to be indecisive, disunited, who had also presided over the Easter Sunday attack, the atrocity of Easter Sunday, whereby Muslim extremists were purportedly responsible for killing over 250 people, where they attacked churches and mosques. Interestingly, with regard to that, again, there has been no accountability, and people are demanding accountability with regard to it. The story that did the rounds was that, and this is of course true, Gotabaya Rajapaksa actually announced his candidacy for president within days of that attack. And there are all sorts of concerns that, well, all of these things may well be related in one way or another. But when he became president, he made three decisions that were pertinent, very directly relevant to the economic crisis that we have. The first one was he reduced the tax base of the country. He reduced it to the extent that the Treasury lost 600 to 800 billion rupees a year. Secondly, he decided to go for organic fertilizer as far as agriculture was concerned. Now, going for organic fertilizer, of course, is not the issue, but what he said was he had to do it overnight. And I think the reason was not any kind of environmental concern or anything like that, but to try to save on foreign exchange. The third one was to adamantly refuse to go to the IMF when all the signs of the impending crisis were manifested. They did not go to the IMF. They insisted on paying our international creditors by digging into our foreign exchange reserves. And as a consequence, we ended up with not a single cent of foreign exchange to buy the basic essentials for daily life in Sri Lanka. We didn't have any dollars to spend on anything because all of it had gone to the international creditors. So what happens? The majority of the people in the country who voted for Gotabaya Rajapaksa by 6.9 million votes and then gave him a 2/3 majority in parliament recognize that what was promised in 2015 when the Rajapaksas were kicked out, accountability in terms of war crimes, in terms of finances, that issue still remained on the table. Something had been done with regard to war crimes, but nothing with regard to financial accountability. They came out. They came out in numbers, first in terms of basic in neighborhoods, but they came out in large numbers and forced Mahinda Rajapaksa from office and then Gotabaya Rajapaksa from office. They were entirely peaceful. There wasn't a single political head of this movement. It was horizontal. It wasn't an apex structure. From neighborhood associations to, yes, certain people who were members of political parties. They all got together on this one single demand that the Rajapaksas had stolen and had to be got rid of, and that they had to return the money. Now, they succeeded in getting rid of Mahinda Rajapaksa as well as Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And they got Ranil Wickremesinghe as first the Prime Minister and now as President. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe is the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka for the 6th time and now the President. In the 2020 election, when he was Prime Minister, he lost his seat. He only got into Parliament because of the peculiarities of our electoral system, which gave his party one bonus seat, which he took 10 months to take. Now, the Constitution says that if a president leaves office, the Prime Minister automatically becomes President for a period of 30 days, within which Parliament must vote to elect the President to fulfill that unexpired term. Ranil Wickremesinghe took the position of Prime Minister and then became President because Parliament voted him as President. He didn't lay down any conditions. He didn't say we want a quick general election. He didn't say abolish the executive presidency. His argument was, look, the economy is in such dire straits that I am taking the job to save the economy. If I don't do it, this country will totally collapse. Now, as I said, he was elected president by Parliament. He was elected president by Parliament. And that means that he was elected president by the majority of MPs from Gotabaya Rajapaksa's party. Therefore, he is seen as a proxy for the Rajapaksas, that he is totally beholden to them and he's, in effect, a captive of that. Now, he's now been president for somewhat 3 months or so. And on the economic side, we have managed to get the staff agreement with the IMF, but it can only be implemented once our international creditors all agree on how much they will take as a haircut with regard to the money we owe them. The problem there is, of course, China. China was never keen on us going to the IMF. They would rather lend us more money to be able to pay the interest on the previous loan. And they are in a position, therefore, to delay or even derail the whole IMF program. Yeah. So we've got the staff agreement. Now we are waiting for the International Creditors Conference, which we hope that Japan will convene, and let's see where we go from there. In the meantime, the situation on the ground has improved a bit because we have been given money, and particularly India has given us something like $4 billion to tide us over. Yeah. The main area, though, where the question of government and governance being imperiled comes into being is with regard to how he has dealt with the Aragale. Ranil Wickremesinghe's argument is that there is a good Aragale and a bad Aragale. The bad Aragale are the ones who want to use violence and they want to overthrow the state. He has used the armed forces to arrest over 3,000 of them. including using the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the draconian piece of legislation which Sri Lanka has promised that there will be an actual moratorium on its use, that it will not be used, but it has reneged on that. Yeah. Now, if you look at it from Ranil Wickremesinghe's point of view, he doesn't have any firm political allies because he has no members of parliament. So he has to reassure the SLPP majority that he is a strong man who will defend them, who will look after them. And also he wants to make sure that when the IMF conditions have to be implemented, and they are going to get worse before they get better in terms of the economic situation, that there will not be any disturbances that will prevent the IMF program from going through. So he's using this partly as a deterrent, partly as a punishment, in order to ensure that the next 2.5 years he'll be able to put the economy on some footing to a recovery and go to elections. Hopefully, as a consequence, there will be a political realignment, and he might well be able to get elected by the people as the president of the country. The question, therefore, what he faces is not a question of legality. It is a question of legitimacy. And that is something that he has to earn, and the only way I guess he can earn that is by saying that, look, okay, I am president for 2.5 years or whatever it is, but I'm really a caretaker president. I wasn't elected to the job. Okay, so yes, I will try to put the economy right, but here is my timetable for elections, here is my timetable for the abolition of the executive presidency. That he is not doing, but that I think is what he should do. Because by dividing the Argale into the good Argale and the bad Argale, and saying that the good Argale, yes, we'll give you spaces in the city of Colombo where you can go and demonstrate and all of that, does not make any sense at all. These are people who have now got energized, they're politically conscious. Yes, they need capacity building because they're not always necessarily politically aware of what has happened in the country. They have to decide whether they're going to join political parties or create political parties of their own. But what he is doing is dividing a population at a time when he needs to unite them. He needs to unite them. He needs to have a clear, cogent, coherent communication strategy that tells people why he is doing this, why they have to bear more burdens, where we are heading to. His political record on the question of communication leaves a lot to be desired. Now, one last section that I would just like to say a few words about is what has this done in terms of Sri Lanka's position internationally and its relationship to the big powers. As I said to you, the Rajapaksas relied on the Chinese to basically as an insurance policy to prevent any kind of sanctions with regard to war crimes and to provide them with money for whatever they wanted in terms of development. But the Chinese have proved that they have a very strong sense of their own self-interest and that they're not coming to Sri Lanka's rescue on the basis of any kind of altruism or generosity. What we have learned is that at the end of the day, it is India and India alone which is the consistent, constant factor as far as our foreign policy is concerned. During the ethnic conflict, also we realized that if India wanted a separate state in the north and east of Sri Lanka, then it would have happened. The ultimate guarantor was not the security forces of Sri Lanka, but the security forces, the policy of India in that respect. So we have to try to go back to that notion of a non-aligned independent foreign policy. India and China will both have interests in Sri Lanka, but I think the competition will be intense, but it should not necessarily be allowed to spill out into conflict. The recent visit of the Chinese surveillance ship, which in a way was balanced by India giving us the two warplanes was one way in which it could happen. It didn't happen by design in that case. It happened fortuitously. But that kind of balancing act, I think, is something that we need to engage in. But the immediate priority is to get the Chinese on board with regard to the haircut. And we are somewhat hopeful because the IMF has agreed to a loan with Zambia, and there the Chinese have, I think, taken a haircut. I'm not quite sure what percentage it is, but there are precedents in the future as far as the future is concerned. Well, where does this leave Sri Lanka? In 2048, we will be 100 years, have 100 years of independence. Sri Lanka at the present moment has, 22 million people, over 1,500 people in the public service, over 275,000 people in the armed forces. The population is aging, unlike the rest of South Asia. 52% of the population are female. In the last 8 months, the passport office has issued 800,000 passports. People within the ages of 18 and 35 are getting a passport and going out wherever they can, by hook or by crook. So we really need to rethink our social contract as well as our economic policy in terms of its orientation. Today, basically, it still is the case that the Sri Lankan economy ultimately relies on women working in garment factories, going out as migrant labor to the Middle East, and working on tea plantations. This is the 21st century. This is entirely unsustainable. But the popular perception, the popular bias is for the culture of entitlement. Any subsidies, any Sri Lankan, you're born, you get free education, you get free medicine, you can get a job in the public service, and you can do absolutely nothing as far as that job is concerned, but you will live and die a public servant, and you will get a pension and all the other amenities that you get from being a member of the public service. Someone has to pay for all of this. One thing that I will say with regard to the current president is that he has, when he speaks, he says that things are really bad, and he tells it how it is. And as a consequence, now might be the point at which the public themselves will realize that they have indeed to make more sacrifices. In early August, my organization did a public opinion survey, and we found that out of the political leadership available, the leader of the JVP, Kumara Dissanayake, polled the highest number of votes in terms of who people would like to see as the leader of the country, some 48%. Ranil Wickremesinghe came second with some 38 or 39%, and then Sajith Premadasa with about 29%. At the same time, the people were asked, in terms of the economy, do you agree that we have to go to the IMF? And overwhelmingly they said yes. So if you take the results of that poll, and I'm not saying that that's going to be the case necessarily, you have them wanting a JVP leadership because they believe that they are incorruptible, that they're untainted by abuse of power and all of that in government. And on the other hand, they recognize that they can't take things for granted on the economic front, that they have to find their own way. So the next elections, which will probably be in 2024, are going to be very interesting. And they indeed are the ones that will decide the fate of that question, the answer to that question in a conclusive way as to whether governance in Sri Lanka is imperiled or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me propose the following format. I'll start with some questions, And then I'll turn to the audience, especially to our Sri Lankan students here, who would, I hope they'll ask questions. And it would, I guess what, I should assume safely that what Sarah has said has engaged them deeply. So this is so my question, Sarah, the first one is, let me say three. I won't have many, but I should just turn to our audience after that. How are minority rights defined in the original constitution? Were minorities given some special rights with regard to language, religious practices, as in India's constitution, as opposed to being simply treated as equal citizens with everyone having equal rights? So what I'm saying is that Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sikhs of India were given religious equality by the constitution, but their educational and cultural rights and religious practice were on top of that specially protected, including via state grants to their educational and cultural institutions. So Sikh colleges, Muslim colleges, etc., Christian colleges had a constitutionally protected status, right? And state grants could also come to them because they were minority institutions. So was the Tamil minority or the burghers were treated as like having the same rights as the Senegalese, or also a special bundle of rights? This is question number one. Question number two is perhaps linked to this. So when India faced the problem of multiple languages, there was a political current which said, let's impose Hindi on everyone, which was spoken by 42% of India only, not a majority, a bit plurality, of course. Ultimately, the solution emerged in the form of three-language formula. What was that? Students in the South, pupils in the South, will be taught in the government school system in their mother tongue. So it could be Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, whatever. Two, they will learn English because that is one way to international language, language of mobility, and professional success would be enhanced or facilitated if you, given that India had been ruled for 200 years by the British. And most of judicial doctrines and medical texts, everything was in English, right? So, and third, they could learn Hindi. Because so much of what 42% of India says its first language is Hindi. This language formula was more or less nationally. Some states said no, only two, English and our language, but generally accepted as the norm. So if you go to South India, the educated South Indian is certainly bilingual, but could be trilingual, educated, right? Now, so tell me about why a bilingual formula, learning both Tamil and Sinhalese, a bilingual formula could not emerge. Instead of that, what emerged was Sinhala only. So if you can enlighten, because around the same time, 1956 Sinhala only, that campaign, 1956 is the time of India's three-language formula, exactly the same time. India's three-language formula is arrived at, and states are asked to adopt it. Most states say yes. Right? Ultimately, since school instruction is a state matter in India, not a federal or central matter, so states had to buy in, and states bought in. Right? The third question, dynasticism dynastic politics is not simply a Sri Lankan problem, right? It's there in Pakistan, it's there in Bangladesh, it's there in India. But an anti-dynastic force emerged in politics in India called Narendra Modi. Right? He has Hindu nationalism also as a defining feature, but one feature is anti-dynastic politics, on which he campaigned vigorously in 2014. Hindu nationalism was not the main plank of campaign in 2014. It was in 2019. In 2014, it was Nehru-Gandhi dynasty has to go. So how do we understand that an anti-dynastic force could not emerge, or maybe did emerge in the form of Premadas, etc.? It's possible. I don't know. You can tell me more about that. Why did it not become a force, given the hold of these dynasties on the politics of the island? So just these three questions, and then we'll go to it.
Okay. The first one with regard to
Minority
minorities.
rights, yeah.
The constitution that we inherited at independence, what we call the Solbury Constitution, because it was drafted by Viscount Solbury, there you had a provision which said that any benefit or privilege given to one community has also got to be given to every other. That was Article 29(2)(b). There was a case that was taken after the Official Languages Act by a guy called Kudeswaran. At that time, it went up to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council threw it out effectively on the grounds that it didn't fall under this stipulation in the Constitution. But that aside, 1972 Constitution, 1977 Constitution, in each one, in the Fundamental Rights Chapter, even though they say that Buddhism must have the foremost place and that Sinhala should be the official language, they do talk about provisions with regard to equality before the law. But we've always had special provisions in terms of our civil laws. So there is a particular section of the Tamil community which abides by the Thesavalame laws of inheritance with regard to land. There is the Kandyan Marriages Act. There is the Muslim community where they have the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, which is very special provisions which now the government says must go because they're deeply discriminatory to women, etc. But we had those laws which were observed, but over the years, and particularly in the Rajapaksa period, they were ignored. They were basically ignored.
So minority religious practices were preserved.
Yes. There were laws
given protection, constitutional protection,
given
but not minority language rights.
No, not necessarily minority language rights.
Yeah.
But the requirement when, in 1987, under the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, part of the provisions of the accord was that Tamil should also be made an official language.
Right.
So legislation was passed, and the English terminology goes is that Sinhala is the official language of the country. Tamil will also be an official language. So that sort of suggests that it has been given second place. But legislation, I mean, we know when we work in terms of local government and provincial government and all of that, legislation is not even translated into the Tamil language. You know, cadre in the police force, Colombo being the most cosmopolitan city in the country, if a Tamil person has an accident, he will probably be asked by a Sinhala policeman to take the statement. Now, the Sinhala policeman will want to take the statement in Sinhala or in very broken English. Likewise, a Tamil person would want to give the statement in Tamil or very broken English. So, what he is signing as a statement which will have validity in a court of law, he doesn't really know what the heck that means.
So this takes us to the three-language formula idea. Why could the two-language formula not come up? Why couldn't the Sinhalese learn Tamil and the Tamil learn Sinhala? Yeah.
Because there's absolutely no incentive for the Sinhalese to learn Tamil. They are 72% of the population. Whereas Tamils and Muslims, well, the Tamils fought against it, but grudgingly, they speak Sinhala now. They speak Sinhala. There is absolutely no incentive for a Sinhalese person to learn Tamil. They would rather learn English. Now, with regard to a trilingual policy in school, I mean, the point is this, is that you go to school and you learn in your mother tongue. So Sinhalese and Tamil children will not mix. They will be in two separate streams. So the segregation begins there. You know, absolute segregation begins there. So you have an educational policy which absolutely institutionalizes this, in fact, this discrimination between the majority and the minority.
One argument that emerged both in Indonesia and India was that a language like English in India, or language like Bahasa Indonesia in Indonesia, which is not the language of the majority community, the Javanese, etc., could be spoken by all, and it belongs to none and could be spoken by all. English has belonged to the British, but English could be that language through which the South could speak to the North. Right?
Right.
So English and Sri Lanka, we know, we've met all the scholars of Sri Lanka who speak beautiful English, and literary scholars, also, literary scholars, anthropology, etc. So what was the argument against English?
The argument against English was that the English would privilege those people who speak English at home and all of that, and therefore you would create what they said in the local Sinhala language, the sword. The people who spoke English and who were proficient in English would use it as a sword against those from the outside. And that was also part of the argument in the first JVP insurrection, that they were largely Sinhala-speaking youth, educated in the Sri Lankan universities, never been abroad or anything like that, but they were fighting against a political order that had largely been educated abroad. Now that's less the case because the political order is not the ones that have been educated abroad. But Jaja Wardner, and when he changed to the executive presidency, etc., he didn't touch the public education system. What he said was that you could have international schools as business concerns. International schools were schools that didn't come under the Ministry of Education. They could operate in the English language and they could do foreign exams, like the London A-levels, the baccalaureate and all of that. Now, the international schools are a thriving concern because all the old elite who do not want to send their children to learn in Sinhala or Tamil are sending their children to the international schools. And so the international schools are now getting the sort of profile of the elite schools in Colombo. You know, so they are the ones who are sending their children out to, and the kids go out to the universities in the States, in the UK, and wherever else. So that's the way that they skirted around it, but that makes no sense because the vast majority of people in the country, the one thing that is, of course, helping with regard to language proficiency and not of a very high standard, of course, is social media. Most Sri Lankans will understand what you say to them in English, even though they are reluctant to speak it, because it's not a phonetic language and they will mispronounce it, and all of that will come into play. But so it's slowly becoming the case that they recognize that, look, you can't compete in a globalized world without having English. Yeah.
Let me turn it around a little. I think if you, the way you put it, 72% of the country, if it spoke Sinhala, had absolutely no incentive to learn Tamil. One could say that India got lucky. Hindi speakers were only 42%.
Yeah, okay, the numbers were different.
If Hindi speakers had been 70%, perhaps the political logic would have been different, the same, as in Sri Lanka. 42% cannot be 72%.
No, exactly.
So you cannot really impose that, right? And you would like to, you know, I mean, in our case, I mean, my third language was Sanskrit. I don't know why. My UP could have, in UP, growing up in UP, I could have been told to learn Tamil or Telugu, but I was, as a child, I never learned. My Sanskrit, third language is Sanskrit, which is unusable. I'm glad I learned those texts and Vedas, etc. Unusable. Huh? Anyway, so India got lucky. If the Sinhala community had been something like 60% or 55%, the political logic could have been different.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so dynasty. finally? Why does a strong anti-dynastic form of politics does not emerge?
Well, I think the reason for, I mean, it has now emerged. Let me start by saying that. It has now emerged in that the people in the Aragalaya have sort of come out and said no more family politics. This has ruined us because the Rajapaksas have brought it right down to the bottom. But I think it probably has taken quite some time because Sri Lanka is essentially, it's a small country, but it's a small feudalist, semi-feudal country. We've never had the kind of social revolution or upheaval in the entire country that has brought us together as one. The only time that Sri Lanka really acted as one in recent memory was in 1996, when we won the World Cup. No, I'm serious. I mean, I myself actually waved the Sri Lankan flag at that point. But we don't have that sort of sense of, we are one people and all of that. It's still very hierarchical in terms of the social mores, etc. And the people who have made it by hook or by crook, by the corruption and all of that, just replicate it.
See, one more, but
Yeah.
two more minutes maybe. So in the development literature, Sri Lanka was always compared to Kerala. You had very high literacy. You have, at this point, I think you are 98 or something,
Yeah.
90, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Like Kerala, like West Europe and United States, that's the kind of literacy level you have. Your infant mortality rate, if I remember, last time I saw it was less than 10, which is also first world infant mortality rate, which means public health system is terrific. Your life expectancy at birth is probably 78, 79, something like that, which is once again first world. And Kerala has also these properties. Now, whether you read Shanta or you read Sen, etc., all of them pointed out there were lots, and Kerala also didn't have a huge private enterprise. They nationalized a lot. And so there were lots of similarities that were pointed out. Except it is argued that you are arguing that Sri Lanka had a very entrenched hierarchy, whereas Kerala smashed hierarchy. The Brahmins were absolutely thrown out. Then you had very different kind of. So the way you started your talk with the claim, which I've heard you make so many times, and others have also made, that there was no freedom movement, but there was also no anti-upper caste social revolution, as in Tamil Nadu to a substantial extent, and in Kerala almost perfectly. So the elite, the traditional elite, was dislodged from power. That did not happen in Sri Lanka, is your claim.
Yeah.
Despite high literacy, despite such remarkable human development indicators.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to our students and our others in the audience. Who will start? Yes, could you also introduce yourself? I would like to get to know you. Yeah.
My name is Luke.
Yeah.
I grew up in Colombo.
Yeah.
And I'm a sophomore now. So do you not recognize
Sorry, you are Nimal's
grandson?
grandson.
Do you not recognize President Premadas's time as an
Dynastical
period?
I was going to ask that also.
Yes, it could well have been. It could well have been, but it didn't last very long. But what it did do was to bring in a new lot of people into the middle and now upper classes, because, again, I mean, the reason why they are now upper class is also because of not entirely transparent and accountable ways in which they made money. Yeah. So if he did succeed in, serving out his term, it may well have been the case. It may well have been the case. So Premadasa, in that sense, is an absolute aberration. Yeah.
And if his son comes to power now?
So now his son is of an entirely different ilk. His son is not from basically the slums of Colombo. His son is not from there. His son has been to Mill Hill College and to the LSE and all of that kind of thing. It's a very different person. And his son would say to you, if my father was alive, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd rather be going to the wildlife reserve parks and taking shots of leopards. And he has told me that, actually. So it's a very, yeah, once they get into power, the next level, of course, they forget where they came from, as it were, and not that they have to sort of glorify it, but they become a different class and all of that. But yes, Premadasa would have been the only one who, well, I mean, he was the only person who was sort of non-Goigama Sinhalese. That's the other dimension which I didn't touch on, which is the caste dimension as well. But he's the only one who's completely outside that power structure.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
A great talk. It's amazing, no slides the first time.
I've known him for very long. He doesn't need slides. Everything is clear here.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm Bill Frank. I'm an alumni. And, I'm a heart surgeon, recently retired. I'm interested in international affairs. And across the water, you are Singapore, right? Singapore has comparable demographic composition as Sri Lanka. But Singapore remained to be quite stable and prosperous since its independence. So what have they done right?
Well, to begin with, Singapore is essentially an involuntary secession. They were kicked out of the Malaysian Federation. Lee Kuan Yew was supposed to have wept when that happened.
Yes, he says that, I think. He says that in his...
So that issue was solved right at the start. Second thing is that Singapore is a city-state. You know, we privilege agriculture back at home.
They have a larger population, right?
Pardon?
You have 22 million.
Yeah. Singapore has...
Singapore 6.
6 million.
Not more than that.
5 or 6 million.
Yeah, 5.6 actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no peasantry ever.
No peasantry.
No peasantry ever. Yeah.
Foreigners are given the best jobs at one level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also the notion that, you know, Singapore has also been very authoritarian.
Correct.
Very, very authoritarian. And that's a sort of untold part of the Singapore story.
Oh no, fairly told.
Huh?
Fair.
All right, okay.
I mean,
But,
if you spit chewing gum, you can be in jail, on the street. Opposition party, they became very vocal. Opposition politician put in jail.
Yeah,
all of that. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Your tale about your country is basically that democracy was hijacked by corrupt and incompetent majority of the people. So democracy is only as good as the voters, right? The character voters. So as long as you don't change your demographic composition, what could happen to a country?
No, you're perfectly correct. I mean, you know, you have 72% or whatever it is, the population who are Sinhalese. But I don't for a moment believe that all 72% want to sort of lord it over the minorities. There are differences in that population as well. What we need actually is to change the electoral system whereby we get the single-member constituencies plus the proportional representation lists, and so that the final number in Parliament will be based on the proportion of votes that have been cast for you overall. In that way, you will get that accountability for the, your personal member of Parliament who you can hold accountable for whatever problems you have, and also the wider accountability of it's a more representative Parliament as well.
But you mentioned the executive power is tremendous.
No, that has to go. There is no question about that. And with regard to the executive power going, it has always been the case. The Constitution says it has to be got rid of in Parliament by a two-thirds majority and a referendum in the country at large. Okay? The issue of a referendum in the country at large has never been in question. The assumption has always been that the people will vote to get rid of it. The problem has always been the Parliament. And the problem has been the Parliament because the executive presidents have created ministries of various shapes and sizes and forms for all of the people who are elected to parliament from their party. You know, and so there was a time where you had only 3 members on the government benches who weren't ministers of any type. You see, so this is another thing that Jajawardena did, is that the idea of the legislature being the deliberative body and the executive being the one that implements policy, he totally destroyed that by saying that we will give every member of parliament, I think it was 5 million rupees, to spend in their constituencies. So they are making deals and all of that, rather than focusing on the whole question of debating policy. Yeah.
The point you were raising about Singapore, I'll come back to it. I won't hear other people, so I'll come back to it. There's also an interesting Malaysia question. Malaysia-Sri Lanka comparison
Is much better.
Donald Horowitz has a very famous paper on that. I'll come back to it if there are no other questions. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tehara. I grew up in Colombo. You started your talk by speaking of this educated elite who went to schools like Oxford and Cambridge right at the beginning, and it was this educated elite that joined politics in Sri Lanka right at the beginning. We look at Parliament today, and it is clear that majority of Parliament right now lacks even a basic education. My question is twofold. How much do you think education plays a role in coming up with successful policies or good governance? And 2, do you think that there should be certain educational requirements or basic credentials in order to enter politics?
The short answer to both those questions is no. I don't think that there should be educational qualifications to get into parliament. And I don't think that, you need educational qualifications per se to be a liberal democrat, both in terms of your politics as well as your governance and being in government. Because, one can think of examples in which the poorest of the poor probably have had a better understanding of what democracy is all about, or what the notion of a representative democracy is about, than the so-called, as you said, Oxford, Cambridge, whatever, educated people. No, I don't believe that at all. And I think, there are, in Sri Lanka, for example, there are movements that sort of say, look, everyone should have O-levels and A-levels, and you should have a basic degree and all of that. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
John Stuart Mill made this argument, the one that you made just now, in case you believe in it. I don't know, maybe you just asked the question. John Stuart Mill's argument was that only the literate, he has a very sort of colorful language. Can you count this much? Can you read this much, etc.? And he describes in representative government. Only those should have the right to vote, let alone entry into parliament. Okay? And the poor also should not have the right to vote, he argued. And the answer to that emerged in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and then Nehru, while dealing with this question, in 1942 made a founding statement about India, that regardless of your education, your worth and dignity is the same as those of others. That has to be the basis of the polity. Who makes the civil service is a different issue.
Yeah.
But the underpinning of the polity cannot be on the basis of either gender or race or religion or your education. And then he was asked, don't the educated people understand how to guide the poor? He said, how can you convince me of that? They certainly know their interests better. And maybe there's a chance they will know the interests of the poor also better. There's a chance. But the chance that they will impose something completely wrong is equally great. So let the poor make mistakes. It's not that we, the rich, and he was trained at Cambridge, that we don't make mistakes. Let the poor make mistakes. But this, among other things, participating in political process also will be a mode of education. There were 2 arguments made. Ambedkar completely supported this argument in India. completely support this argument. And he added one more thing, that the Dalits are not educated because they didn't want to be educated. They were not educated, they were denied education. So he said, if you made education the basis for the polity, then he said it's a double punishment. First, you didn't let them get educated because of the way Dalits were treated, and second, you're saying because you're not educated, you won't have the right to vote, or you can't enter parliament. He called it a double punishment, and a sinister one. Right? So this argument that you made, if you believe in that, that was certainly the 19th century democratic argument, late 19th century. And John Stuart Mill is a very big thinker. He has loads and loads of things to say about this. Why the illiterate should not have, the innumerate should not have, the poor should not have. He was only progressive on women. Women should have the right to vote. He was the first great political philosopher to make that case. Right? Other than that, he said, etc. So this is just a response to the question. I'm agreeing with what Sarah just said, that I'm also giving you the political theory behind this very important question that you're asking. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Aman, also born and bred in Colombo. I'm curious on your thoughts about the future political leadership, given the election is 2 years down the line. You said, as Sajid says, you'd rather be seeing leopards, and Ranil represents the old guard of more elite and removed from the population, and as you mentioned, is also caged by the SLPP. So who is that, and who could we anticipate to take the role?
Well, the way I see it, Ranil is the president at the present moment. The SLPP majority, two-thirds majority almost in parliament, is breaking up into various factions. Now, those factions, at least 2 or 3 of them, would not want to see Ranil succeed in the way that Ranil would like to succeed. And Ranil would not want them to be able to form as one cohesive group, because he hopes that he can cannibalize them and build up the UNP, take the younger people from the SLPP. Also, because of Sajith Premadasa's demonstrated restraint or ambivalence towards taking power, I think he hopes that the old UNP in the SJB will also come back. So that he could go to the elections as a UNP candidate with a strengthened, revitalized party. But if that does not happen, you will have Ranil Wickremesinghe, Sajith Premadasa, presumably he will agree to run as president, Anura Kumara Dissanayake. Now, we don't know who the SLPP will put forward. But one thing that I found interesting was, in August 2000, when Chandrika brought her constitution to Parliament and talked about creating a union of regions, it was the first constitution that went beyond the unitary state. Mahinda Rajapaksa opposed it, and he was a minister in her cabinet. The Mahanayakas, the chief priests of Malvatta and Asgiriya, gave Mahinda Rajapaksa a title as Defender of the Faith. They did a very similar thing only about a week ago, just before the Geneva opened, the session started, to Shavindra Silva. Shavindra Silva, who was the army commander and who is the chief of defense staff, who has a travel ban slapped on him. He can't come to the United States, for example. So they might run someone like that, and they might again run on the card of communalism. Because at the end of the day, Gotabaya got his legitimacy from those in robes and those in uniform. Those in uniform, I don't think it's going to work anymore, because they would have then used force against the Aragalaya on the 9th of May and all of that, but they desisted. So it's going to be very interesting, because, Sajith Premadasa and Ranil Wickremesinghe will probably be vying for the same vote. So that gives Anura Kumara Dissanayake a possible lead in that sense. But I doubt whether he will win 50 plus 1%. So he might push the election to a second round.
And when it comes to the second round, then only the top 2 are left.
Top 2 are left.
And you have to win 50% plus 1, right? That's the basic principle, and several polities have that. So.
Yeah.
It can't be by plurality.
No.
It has to be
50
majority.
plus one, yeah.
What does an AKD presidency look like to you?
What presidency?
Andhra Kumara Dissanayake, the JVP. Well, the JVP has come a long way from 1988-89. Right? They served in government in 2004. They have very sort of atavistic, primordial notions with regard to the economy. And that's the big problem here. I don't think they are fully agreeable that the IMF is not the same IMF of the 1970s and 80s, you know, and they have absolutely, they won't budge on the question of the unitary state and devolution. I mean, I have, in my conversations with them, I have told these guys, look, you know, if you support devolution, you can go and contest an election in Jaffna and win because everything else that you stand for will be supported in Jaffna. And the argument there was, I mean, I told him this, and I also said, look, you have to come out and make a public apology, at least, for the horrific things that you did in 88, 89. And the answer is, we can't betray our comrades who gave their lives for these things. So, I mean, there you are. Yeah. So, Andhra Kumara, I mean, he is making the right sounds with regard to transparency and accountability and all of that, but on the economy, I'm really not convinced that he has got it right. No.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
And I'm here because the Caribbean and Sri Lanka play cricket, and most of my contact actually with people from Sri Lanka has been when they've come to the Caribbean to play cricket. So this has been very informative for me.
So cricket, but professor of sociology at Brown. Yeah, that's also.
So yeah, this is very informative.
And those who know cricket should also know that Viv Richards is his classmate.
Oh.
Okay.
So, two things. Now, the islands of the Caribbean are tiny. You know, Sri Lanka for us is a
22 million is a big island.
country, right? But a lot of the problems that you were describing, we have in the Caribbean.
Absolutely.
The problems with dynasties. The Bird dynasty in Antigua, classic manifestation of that. And, you know, my perception of it is that there's an element, I call it patrimonialism, and I don't know what else to call it, that there's a strong sort of hangover of that. So when things get rough in the Caribbean, in particular, if you are a strong leader, like V.C. Bird was, or even Eugenia Charles in Dominica, they start calling you Ma and Pa. They are looking for not an executive leader, not a modern political leader. They want a father
And a mother.
or a mother.
Or a mother,
Yeah. And of course, the politicians, they salivate at that. And once they get into power, they exploit that, you know? And that cycle is what has kept us, you know, on the cycle of corruption, people being manipulated, and the quality of the politics not being what it should be. And then now, the other side of this, for me, is the rise of neoliberalism. That the Caribbean, like Sri Lanka, was schooled on protected markets, and we've never made that transition from being able to perform well within a framework of protected markets. So our great economist, Lloyd Best, had a great cricket analogy to describe our situation under neoliberalism. And he said, neoliberalism is a googly. I mean, this is a certain type of ball that you bowl in cricket. You know, baseball, I mean, I think if you're in America, I think the knuckleball would be the best thing, analogy to a googly, right? It's a ball that comes at you moving, you don't know which way. Anyway, so Lloyd Best said that neoliberalism is a googly that Caribbean leaders have not yet found a way to hit out of the park. And I think that's the best way to describe the economic situation in the Caribbean. That we were growing, we were very comfortable under the Keynesian model where, you know, the state sector could be dominant, you bring in the private sector, and, you know, that kind of system. The entrepreneurial class in the Caribbean has just been wiped out under neoliberalism. You know, I mean, what it has done really is to produce one great entrepreneur and to kill off all of the rest. And I'm sure most of you know Sandals, the hotel chain.
Resort.
Yeah.
Sandal Resort.
Yeah, and that's Butch Stewart's thing. And Butch Stewart was really somebody who used to walk around the countryside of Jamaica selling wares to people. And then he rose all the way to this great hotel chain. So he's the exception. He's the one business who has survived on his own under this.
But his claim was that this enormous state control over the economy has hurt Sri Lanka. And this over-Keynesian kind of, right, so not Keynesian, but over-Keynesian sort of state, which is creating jobs for as an entitlement. And so I thought, and he'll of course defend himself if I'm, you know, he says that whatever was wrong with Jayawardena, but opening up the economy and embracing neoliberalism first in South Asia, before India in 1991, right? I think his view is that was a good thing.
It made a difference.
Well, I can't say the same for the Caribbean. That's
Yeah,
all
but
I'm saying.
the issue could well be that they are 22 million and your biggest is 5,
Of course.
right?
So-
There is a bit of market,
Of course.
internal market, right?
Sure.
Do you think oil in Guyana is going to make a difference?
I don't think so. If they don't really change the model, I cannot see them doing any better than
Okay.
Trinidad or Jamaica with bauxite. That I thought that they were going to negotiate in a very different way with the Chinese. Now, I've been saying to these guys, look at how the Chinese organize foreign investment. They have forced, you know, the Europeans and the Americans to partner with them. We should be demanding that is the way in which we want to do foreign investment with the Chinese. You know this works better.
Can I, the Caribbean Sri Lanka comparison, there's one important thing here which, let's see how you come out on that. You heard his description of ethnic relations. That the Sinhala Tamil relationship began to really sour badly in 1956-57 and has been souring ever since. There is no great redemption there, right? Caribbean is also multi-ethnic. Can you say something about how ethnic relationships have been handled?
Oh, I mean, we have serious conflict
Yeah.
between Hindus and Christians, and also Hindus and Muslims, right? That.
But no civil war ever.
Huh?
No civil war.
Well,
but it gets pretty nasty.
It gets
in the
nasty.
sense
and they
that-
have fled. And they have fled. I think the Guyanese Indians are all in New York now.
Oh, but no. That to me is the failure to respond to neoliberalism. It's not really the
The ethnic-
internal fighting. The internal fighting always remain on the symbolic level. You know, come election time, they'll put up an effigy of the Indian, somebody like Capilio or somebody who's, and they would hang you in effigy, and the same goes, that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah, I
But
suppose.
it never really got down to that nitty-gritty kind of fighting that you had. And I think the main reason for that is the economy was always expanding. And whoever was in power made sure that, yeah, my people got most of the jobs, but I'm not gonna take it all. And so, Eric Williams, right? Look at the number of Hindus and Muslims that were integral parts of his government. But then, so it's been a civil fight. And I think that the fighting, right, has everything to do with the amount of expansion in the economy and how that expansion is distributed. The things were worse in Guyana because Guyana just did not have the kind of resources to distribute that Trinidad had. But now with oil,
Yeah.
we will see.
But Patrick, as Shanta Devarajan here a week ago was explaining, even during civil war, Sri Lankan economy grew
No, wow.
quite substantially. So it was expanding. Despite economic expansion,
Come to the
it kept
Caribbean
running
and
into
tell us how
trouble.
you did that.
Yeah.
We would want to know.
Well, I guess one of the principal reasons is that Prabhakaran didn't have missiles to fire on Colombo.
Say that again?
Prabhakaran did not have missiles to fire on Colombo.
Oh,
So it was a relatively isolated theatre of war, except for the acts of terrorism that happened, which was assassinations.
Or the attack on the Sri Lankan Airlines and the attack
So-
on your stock market.
No, so
Huh?
the attack on Sri Lankan Airlines that happened, and immediately the growth figures dropped. We went to below zero.
Aha. So you're saying the theater of conflict was geographically limited, so the economy could grow.
Yeah.
That's the argument. And the attacks on Kandy Temple of Truth or the stock market or Sri Lanka, these are episodic, basically episodic.
Yes.
Had they been sustained in Colombo,
Then it would have been a
Sri Lankan economy would have plummeted.
Absolutely.
I see.
No,
That is the argument. Okay. Yeah.
but-
Yeah. Go ahead,
I'm
Paddy.
curious about your stock market. Does it really deliver, for companies? See, in the Caribbean, we shouldn't even call it the stock market. Sometimes 6 companies will trade in a day, and they're all family companies.
Well, have you heard of a system of working the stock market which is called pump and dump?
No.
Say more.
Uh,
Say more.
You go for companies that are very low in terms of their stock prices, etc., and then you start buying up. The moment they hit a particular price, you dump them and you make your profits. And this was something that was done by, probably about 5-6 people, really.
Okay, about how many companies are on your stock market?
I don't know. Any idea how many companies? I honestly don't know what the figure is. It's not a huge amount, but
You can already count on your hands the number of people in our stock market.
Also, once again, the 22 million may matter here,
Yeah.
as opposed to
Sure.
3 or 5. Yeah, it may matter here. Now, of course, you can say Singapore is only 5.6, but Singapore's per capita income today is $69,000, is higher than the United States, and 1.5 times that of Britain, its former colonial master. So $69,000 per capita multiplied by 6.9 gives you a rather impressive market,
It's
and you can do quite a lot with it, right?
Yeah. Singapore's also been a financial center.
Oh yes,
yeah.
295 companies.
Huh?
295.
295 companies in the stock market of
295
Colombo.
stock market.
Oh, okay.
Not 6. Yeah.
Well, I know in the Caribbean as well, it's on.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not a dynamic thing, you know, not at all. And so it's done because the neoliberal policies demanded it, right? Even in the Eastern Caribbean, Little Antigua, we got a stock market, you know. I mean, Eastern Caribbean, you talk together, it's like 1 million people. Very few entrepreneurs.
Who's your greatest Sri Lanka cricketer? May I ask? Who did you enjoy most?
We don't
Muralidharan, Sangakkara,
Sure.
Mahila Jayawardena,
Sure.
or the 1996 team? That was very, very different. Huh?
He's taking us in a hole.
Anyway, if I may, last 5 minutes, can I return to this Malaysia Sri Lanka comparison? That was very important in comparative politics.
Were
There's
there
a-
questions? Yeah.
Oh, please. I'll stop myself. Yeah, go ahead. Ask. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One was about the similarity that he was raising between multi-ethnic societies. So, like, I come from not Colombo but Guinea, which is similar in the sense that it has some of the issues that Sri Lanka is facing, and even the history of like the way things unfolded is kind of a little bit similar. I had a professor make the claim that multi-ethnic societies would benefit from like a federalist system like the U.S. Where do you stand on that in terms of like accountability and having representation in government? And then 2, could you elaborate on China and India's interest in Sri Lanka?
Well, in answer to your first question about multi-ethnic communities and federalism, I am a great supporter of a federal Sri Lanka for exactly those same reasons. And, you know, the thing is, in the Sri Lankan context, of course, it has been brought up as being an answer to an ethnic question. But I think there is an argument for federalism that is non-ethnic, and that is that it, you know, empowers people everywhere. Because when we were advocating federalism for the Constitution, we went around the country and we did some, you know, workshops and stuff like that. And the people, farmers, for example, were absolutely thrilled at the point that, look, we don't have to go to Colombo to ensure that we get a hospital or whatever it is, we can do it here. You know, that whole principle of subsidiarity and all of that. So I think it is also a form of government that can enhance governance as well. The India-China thing, I mean, you know, my point at the end of the day is this, is that I suspect that the Chinese are also finding that they may have overextended themselves. You know, because after all, at the end of the day, the initial argument against going to the IMF was the argument of that, look, you know, if we make an exception with you guys, we'll have a whole lot of others knocking on our door, and we can't afford to do that. Yeah. So, as a consequence, I think China is interested in Sri Lanka largely because of that whole thing about the sea lanes and its energy supplies and all of that. But India and Sri Lanka have a bond that goes beyond that. You know, it goes far beyond that. And as I said, it's a love-hate relationship. We take it for granted at one level. We know that at the end of the day, the Indians will come to our rescue in one way or another, although most recently the Indian government has said no more cash for you guys, you know, until you implement the IMF program. But I think that too is part of the pressure that India and the US are putting through the IMF to call the Chinese to book. You know, that is also playing. The Indians and the Americans want to ensure that the Chinese are called to book and play the game in the way that the rules have been set, and that this exposes the, you know, BRIC, all those initiatives, etc., and the shortcomings with regard to them. Yeah.
Tehara is the last question.
You just said that you think China has overextended themselves. How does that sort of tie to China's debt trap diplomatic practices?
Well, it's because of those debt trap practices that they probably overextended themselves. Because, you know, Sri Lanka could very easily have gone to China and said, yes, okay, give us more money. we are going to keep borrowing from you and keep borrowing from you and extending, putting ourselves deeper and deeper into the trap. But there is enough information, etc., around to warn countries that this is unsustainable. You can't just put your eggs in one basket. It is still a fairly globalized economy, and you can't just go with the Chinese alone. It's just not going to work. And I mean, the point is China really in a position to be the United States of America in 1948? I don't think so, not yet.
Not yet, certainly.
Certainly not. Certainly not. You know, so
The per capita income is still 12,500,
yeah.
and it's number 2 in size,
Hmm.
but not number 2 in per capita income. And per capita income is probably 38th or 40th, or maybe 30th, something like that. Per capita income is not in the top 30. Size-wise it is. And United States in 1948, both in per capita income and size, was number 1. That's a very different economic ball game then that you can play, right? So it's so Sarah, you're right. I think these numbers would suggest the validity of what you're saying. Okay, so it's time for an applause for a great talk, as
Thank you,
always,
thank you.
as always.
Thank you.
And please join us for a reception outside. You can carry the conversation further. I know we have Sri Lankan students here who will have lots of questions, and Paget may have some cricketing questions. So.
Can I just ask one
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
How many of the Sri Lankan students went to international schools? 1, 2?
How many Sri Lankan students are
Students are
here?
here.
How many are here? What's the denominator?